Hello and welcome. Today is the 21st of September, and I'm joined by Ridenour, a renowned international journalist who's been working in publishing for over 50 years all around the world, in particular Latin America. Ridenour has published several books, and I'm going to reference a couple right now. One is Backfire. It's a great revealing investigative piece of work in how the Cuba infiltrated the CIA and uncovered a lot of their criminal plots to sabotage that country and assassinate the leader Fidel Castro. Ron's book, published in 1991, was based on interviews with Cuban agents who infiltrated the CIA and exposed a whole suite of nefarious operations. His latest book is The Russia Peace Threat, and published in 2018, but absolutely timely to what's happening today in Ukraine and elsewhere. In this book, Ron goes over a century of aggression by the United States and its Western allies towards, well, formerly the Soviet Union and then latterly Russia. And over the last century, since the October Revolution in 1917, the United States has been obsessed with defeating Russia in various ways. It's culminating now in this proxy war that we are seeing horribly unfolding, persisting in Ukraine. We could maybe talk about that in a while. So there's the two excellent books that I recommend you look into. Ron, welcome, first of all.
Yeah, but thank you. I want to say thank you also for mentioning those books, because some of the content in them I want to mention in our talk today. But before we get into the details of the CIA plot and where Denmark is with this, because I'm living in Denmark and I've written a lot about Denmark, but I first want to say to the Russian people that my heart goes out to you. I feel your suffering, and I'm very sorry about it. You lost 13% of your people in the Second World War, 27 million people. The United States lost 1/3 of 1%. The so-called Great Britain, the colonist slave English, lost 1%. And even before the Second World War was over, the United States was planning, while Russia was still, Soviet Union was still an ally, they were planning to destroy it with 400 nuclear bombs to be dropped in 1950, an operation Truman started that called Operation Drop Shot. And they would have attacked 200 cities, 100 cities, 200 targets, and wiped out millions and millions of people, and then taken over the rest of your country. And I hope that the whole world could get to know this. And I'm proud to know that your president is aware of that. I think he made a big mistake when he helped Bush, in the Taliban war, and they're back after 20 years of total destruction for no reason at all that has anything to do with democracy. But the president has changed his mind about being friends with the United States and realized that it's totally impossible. They don't have friends. They only have vassal states. Mm-hmm. And I live in one of them, Denmark.
So this, Ron, this is why your book, The Russian Peace Threat, is such an excellent, timely book, because it documents how this aggression has been building over a century, through the Cold War period, well, before the Second World War, after the Second World War, with the Americans and the British recruiting Nazi officers, spies, saboteurs in Ukraine to attack the Soviet Union. This went all over then. 5 decades of the Cold War, and then over the last 30 years of the so-called post-Cold War period. So this is culminating now in this proxy war in Ukraine, which has been going on for the last 18 months. Ron, we'll talk about that more, I hope so, in the next half hour. But I want to get to a point that you've made to me, Ron, that you see very disturbing evidence recently, signals that the United States would very much, stepping up its efforts to assassinate the Russian President Vladimir Putin. Can you elaborate on that? You said you've seen signs in the media, etc., that would indicate that there is a serious effort to try to kill President Putin of Russia.
Yes, definitely. I am worried that the CIA is plotting, probably with MI6, to murder President Putin. And there are several reasons. First, I became knew personally, Phil Agee, who was the CIA officer's, probably the first CIA officer whistleblower, came out in the late 60s and wrote this great book, The CIA Diary. His son, Chris Agee, is the editor of the Covert Action magazine, to which I write, and sometimes I write for you. And their managing editor, Jeremy Kuzmarov, is writing a series of the people that the CIA has assassinated. They were born with that as their credo: assassination, regime change, as they call it, covert actions of all kinds. And Phil Agee, one of the main jobs he had when he was in Ecuador and other countries in Latin America was to plant false information or false flagging information, or plant, the enemy is coming and we have to get rid of them somehow. And so, one of the enemy leaders, the next day or in a month is assassinated. That was one of his jobs, Carl Bernstein, who was the co-editor of the major Watergate scandal expose out of the Washington Times before it was a CIA newspaper.
The Washington Post, Ron. Sorry.
Yeah, the Washington Post is now a CIA newspaper, owned by Jeff Bezos, who does their technology for them. He's won billions of dollars in contracts to try to prevent another Edward Snowden or Chelsea Manning from downloading secrets, right? That was, the major thing he did the same year he bought the Washington Post. Now, Carl Bernstein wrote about numbers of people, and he even named some, as Phil Agee named some CIA officers. Carl Bernstein wrote about how many U.S. journalists, so-called journalist reporters, whores for wars, I call them, were on the CIA payroll, and the editors, of course, and owners of these newspapers and televisions, collaborate with the CIA. So when they want to assassinate somebody or make a regime change, there's some build up to it. Now, at the same time that North Korea's President Kim was meeting with President Putin in Russia, the Daily Star, which is some kind of, slander rag, published a so-called article citing a Russian renegade political scientist by the name of Valery Slovery, who was also interviewed by the right-wing richest Russian, Michael Chodorkovsky. And that, they're saying that, and the same time, with Putin and Kim, that Putin hasn't been seen for a year, and he's sick somehow or another. They know he's sick, and that he has some disease which they don't mention, and that he will be dead by the end of autumn this year. Let's say before Christmas. Somebody somehow or another, he's going to be dead. Now, the same day, this was printed in the major Danish newspaper and TV, and they just took it verbatim. And I'm going to get into Denmark a little bit later, but it's relevant to this issue. They call President Putin a despot. I mean, this is a newspaper and this is a television station. The state-owned one in Denmark is saying this. Mm-hmm. Then the next day, the most prestigious weekly news magazine called Foreign Affairs editor comes up now with a new version of Bush's axis of evil. And she says, the new axis of evil is 4. And that's, of course, Putin's Russia. There's not 140 million people there. It's just Putin's Russia. And Xi's China, and Kim's North Korea, and Iran. It's like what we saw, in other assassinations. The CIA has assassinated at least 15 African leaders. They didn't get to pull the trigger on the most well-known one, Patrice Lumumba, but they were demonizing him and other African leaders that were assassinated. To make it look like they're a Hitler. And and not in this media here, but some, media calls Putin a Hitler, for Christ's sakes. They lost 27, you lost 27 million people, And what was the United States doing when Germans and Mussolini and Franco, they were supplying them with all kinds of weaponry, trucks, engines, IBM, the biggest families that still exist, the Rockefellers, the Fords, the Morgans, they were fascist in the United States, and they had a coup planned against FDR. They were going to kill him or get rid of him somehow and put in one of their puppets. And General Smedley Butler exposed that, and it was in the New York Times in 1933 that the war in Germany was not won by the ruling class of the United States. It was won by primarily the Russian people, and then the Nazis that invaded it, along with the Nazi Finns, who now are in NATO, and I'm very worried about the 1,500-kilometer border, because they could become Nazis again. So the United States was already planning to destroy the people. So why not, do it today? They just gave permission to this fascist traitor Jew president who bans every party that he doesn't like and no unions, etc. They just gave him permission to invade Russia with missiles that can go 300, kilometers.
And Vladimir Zelensky. Yeah, Vladimir Zelensky, the Ukrainian president you're referring to.
Well, of course.
Yeah. Yeah. So, Ron, yeah, I mean, there's a long and nefarious history that you're getting into here. But getting back to the point about Putin, you think that you're seeing a repeat of a pattern of vilification, demonization, media setting up as a target for then an assassination plot to be kind of triggered or to be kind of unleashed. You're saying that there is a kind of an operation, a propaganda operation, a psychological warfare operation to condition the Western public into accepting a murder, state-sponsored murder of Putin.
Right. Yeah. I'm definitely saying that is a real possibility.
Because of in particular, Rob, because of the media, the pattern of media, recent media activity.
They're starting a scenario. They're starting a scenario in the media that I've seen in 2 countries now. England, and I don't know what gets printed in the United States. It probably has been reported there. And of course, I mean, it's like. I mean, if they killed their own president. I mean, there's all kinds of evidence. It will never be finally admitted, but I mean, even the Senate and House committees in the mid-70s called forth a reinvestigation of the Warren Report, in a sense, like, wasn't there a conspiracy? And their conclusion was that it was. Now, they can't come out and say the CIA did it, but they had the top leaders of the CIA as witnesses, and and they murdered two mafia guys who helped murder president, and one of them,
Kennedy, John F. Kennedy.
Yeah, so Sam Giancana, who was the major mafia liaison with the CIA in murdering President Kennedy, he wrote a book. I mean, his son and his grandson wrote a book that he gave them to, it was like oral history, and saying he named the people in the mafia and the CIA who pulled the triggers on Kennedy. Now, he was the only president, and it took him, a couple of years in office to realize that a nuclear war would be catastrophic for everybody. And he didn't even want, Americans being killed, right? And he said maybe 1 million Americans would be killed, so they're not going to do it. Well, and then in the missile crisis, it was Russians who turned back to prevent a nuclear war. The great hero, Navy Captain Vasily Arkhipov, turned his U-boat around when the Navy ships were coming in the blockade. They had only one nuclear missile, but it could have, been shot. And the submarine crew thought that they were being attacked by this Navy. And he said, no, we're not going to start the Third World War. And many have called him he saved the World War, nuclear World War. As my friend is writing a book, Dave Lindorf, about this, the U.S. spy in the Manhattan Project giving information to the Soviets so they could make their bomb before the United States invaded them, and it succeeded. Ted Hall was therefore also the savior of a nuclear war.
But Ron, do you not think, say if the CIA were crazy enough to, absolutely have got the how would you say, the lack of morals to do such a thing, like kill a head of state, I mean, would that not be suicidal? I mean, that would start the nuclear Third World War, surely. How would they?
Not surely. I don't know Russia. I've never been there other than an overnight, and but of course there are people in Russia who don't, like Putin. There are people in Russia, I'm sure, who are on the payroll of the United States. I mean, the United States bought Yeltsin, for Christ's sakes, for those 10 years in Yeltsin. Bill Clinton and Wall Street took over Russia's economy. They destroyed the economy, and Yeltsin was stupid enough to go along with it. Only before the election in 96 or something, only 8% of the people were, wanted him to be president. Somehow or another, all the money and propaganda that Wall Street poured in got him to be president again. Even after he had killed several hundred people, in the parliament, etc. I mean, it's possible. I mean, not everybody is an angel in Russia, right? I mean, there's no country that has.
So there might be.
This would split the country. This would make the people, worry, what's going to happen now. I mean, if they can get rid of Putin or however else they might think got killed, of course, a lot of Russians are going to know what I'm talking about. He's just not going to die overnight, from some kind of.
You're saying, Ron, I mean, it could be a very callous, cold-blooded calculation to inflict a shock or impact on the Russian people, where they would be, immensely disorientating to their government.
And create what they like to call the color revolution, right?
Right, trigger a color revolution at the grave risk of possibly starting a nuclear war. But do you think they're quite capable of kind of coping with that, or that kind of risk, handling that kind of risk, or taking that kind of risk, that in this gambit of, like, you kill a Russian president, could trigger a Third World War, nuclear Third World War, the end of everything, or else they're betting that it would trigger a color revolution and just topple the Russian leadership. Do you think
Yeah,
that
I mean,
that kind of that
I can't see
that
how the generals or whatever would happen, whoever was going to take charge, given the hypothetical that the president is now dead. I mean,
mm,
I can't see the Russian system immediately attacking the United States with nuclear bombs. I mean, they would have no proof. The CIA is clever enough to do this kind of thing without obvious proof immediately.
mm,
It could not. I can't imagine the Russian people have never generals have never been that crazy. So, but if it created enough chaos internally, the U.S. could seize upon that opportunity. I mean, they've had a first strike. My friend Daniel Ellsberg. I mean, we were friends. We were in demonstrations together in Los Angeles against the wars. He's the man who the Pentagon Papers. He knows personally, that the United States from day one has always had an initial, surprise strike against Russia on their agenda all the time. So,
mm,
if there's enough chaos going on, like they created, they were involved in in doing this in 2014 in Ukraine. That's how they, created a neo-fascist
mm,
coup. And
mm,
every one of the leaders in that new government were pointed out by, Obama and Biden and their, agent Newland. So, I mean, they could do this again. So why not just, throw a few bombs on Russia in a moment like that when they're off guard?
mm,
And and if they've got those 5 minutes, whatever that timing is, they figure, oh, okay, the Russians maybe could get some after a while, but who gives a fuck? I mean, I'm sure that the CIA was behind. Okay, and a lot of people that are watching this, okay, now he's really one of these conspiracy theorists. Yeah, okay. Well, the greatest conspiracy theorist and actors in the world is the CIA. I mean, that's their
mm,
modus operandi. They're conspirators number one. And one of the things I think they did was 9/11, and that gives them all the excuses they wanted to make all the wars since then.
mm,
And a lot of people in the United States in opinion polls don't say the CIA did it, but they don't believe what the Yankees said, who did it.
mm,
Some Saudi Arabians, that were their best friends in the Gulf War, were Saudi Arabians, and nothing happened to Saudi Arabia, and they invaded Afghanistan instead, and then Iraq instead of Saudi Arabia. I mean,
mm.
it's just so like your president, the Russian people's president has said, finally, Senor Putin, the empire of lies. And I wrote articles about that for the SCF. And it's also the empire of evil. I mean,
Mm.
they have
Well,
no qualms about any kind of disaster.
yeah. So it's certainly within the realms of operations to assassinate Russian President Vladimir Putin. That's absolutely, you know, that would be fairly standard. I mean, they could very easily do it. Biden has personally vilified Putin as a dictator and as a killer. Ironically, for one who has sponsored dozens of wars and interventions around the world, Biden accuses Putin of being a thug and a tyrant and a dictator and a killer. So the demonization is certainly there to justify the killing of a murder of a Russian president, but also the impunity, Ron. I mean, we're coming up to a year this week coming on the 26th of September, the Nord Stream
Yeah.
pipelines, these massive infrastructure pipelines project under the Baltic Sea, the seabed, were blown up on the 26th of September. Now, the very respected, legendary investigative journalist Seymour Hersh, with good sources, has reported that President Biden, actually signed off on that operation to blow up those pipelines. They were Russian owned, mostly, also owned by Germany. It was in Danish waters, wasn't it? Off an island in Danish waters. Now, a year has passed, and as the Russian foreign minister said this week, not one Western authority has taken the trouble to investigate what actually happened. Probably the biggest crime of the decade, the blowing up of gas pipelines in international, running under international waters owned by European states. What's your take on it, Ron? Is this just Western state terrorism with impunity?
Well, if the whores for wars, so-called reporters, would remind people what they had to report on February 7th, 2022, what their own fucking president said. There will be no Nord Stream pipelines if Russia or Putin invades Ukraine. A week later, they made their special military operation invasion. And Putin, and Biden repeated it. I, promised there will be no, pipelines. The same week, the same day or day next, the so-called feminist, so-called social democrat prime minister of Denmark said, we're breaking all the rules that we've had for decades and decades, and we're inviting, that's to say, we're welcoming the big daddy troops to come here, all the military weapons they want, and bases. And now, since then, they've been spending hundreds of millions of dollars building, expanding 2 harbors so that the gigantic nuclear weapon loaded ships from the United States can come here. The so-called Viking queen of this country, another whore for war, said she looked into Putin's eyes and was cold. He was cold. There was coldness. Now, she forgot what her big daddy Bush said about Putin's eyes when he rang Bush and said, I'm sorry, that, somebody, did the 9/11 and we're willing to help you. And they offered them 2 military bases to use, intelligence to use, to fight the Taliban. And Putin then said, well, we would love to come into NATO. And then, there would be, we would be friends and there wouldn't be wars. And, he also added maybe the same day or another day, it would be nice if the CIA stopped, supplying and training and arming Islamic Muslim terrorists in our territory, So what did Bush do? He said, first, he said, I'm going to read it, quote, I looked the man in the eye. I find him to be very straightforward and trustworthy. He had a very good dialogue. I was able to get a sense of his soul, a man deeply committed to his country and the best interest of his country, and I appreciate so very much the frank dialogue. Now, they have forgotten all about that, or have they also gotten rid of Bush? Maybe he is not any longer able to say anything. Like Eisenhower, Kissinger, one of the greatest war criminals in the history of U.S., many, many war crimes. He said, hey, let's not do a nuclear war. And this Ukrainian CIA front website, whatever it's called, I can't remember this name, said, put Kissinger's name on it as somebody that, could be targeted, for Christ's sake. They're fucking crazy.
Yeah.
They're crazy. They're really crazy. They're threatening this war criminal,
Ron, it is really shocking and disturbing that these pipelines are blown up. Like, what did they cost? Something like $20 billion over a decade of work.
The greatest pollution of metals in the history of pollution.
Vital to European energy economy, the German economy in particular. As you say, all the pollution that it caused. Like an absolute vast crime, and the European states have just absolutely turned a blind eye to it. They've not investigated. They've buried it. Now, the thing is,
they did investigate.
This getting back to your initial point about, a possible assassination attempt against a Russian president, which might seem absolutely crazy or shocking or improbable to a lot of people listening into this. But if the United States can get away with such a outrageous crime, vast crime, blowing up the oil pipeline with impunity, I mean, that sets the rogue behavior free to do whatever it wants, including a preemptive strike on Russia or whatever, because nobody is holding this rogue state to account. And this is the very frightening, alarming situation we're in.
Exactly. I mean, I was going to say something about, no, regardless of all the wars, all the crimes that the United States has done, no country sanctions them. As all the 50 states of the U.S. owns are sanctioning Russia every day, et cetera. They're even willing to, have, inflation, and they're even willing to have, we're paying 3 times as much money just to have this conversation with electricity, et cetera. There's no doubt about it that the United States did it, and Seymour Hersh is exposed with the Norwegian Navy's, direct support. And it was the Navy SEALs, probably SEALs, who are experts in doing this, the U.S. SEALs that, plant these bombs down there. Now, this is in Denmark's economic territory. So they knew it was happening. If not the day before, they knew it's happening. Denmark, and not Norway, but Sweden and Germany, dumb as they can be, investigated. They sent down, they did whatever, and they came back and said, yeah, they can see the holes and they can see that it was sabotage. They didn't want to say officially who did it. I mean, Germany lost also billions of dollars in this. They were part owners of this. How they can have a social democrat, and then a green foreign minister, want war. In fact, Scholz didn't even want war, but then he was forced to do it. I mean, for Christ's sake, that's also a thing with this war. The United States wants to take over the German, especially the German and France economy. I mean, that's part of, capitalist competition, right? So you have a good war so that you can have capitalist competition and steal other people's economy. So that's a part of this as well. So there was an investigation. The UN is so weak that they deny, they won't do an investigation. I mean, everybody knows who did it, for Christ's sake. Biden already said it to everybody. Why should it even be a question? But nobody's going to point the finger. No one court in the history of U.S. crimes, of hundreds and hundreds of wars, the U.S. Congress itself admits 350 wars. Only 6 of them are called wars. They call the others humanitarian democratic things. And they say they do not count the covert actions of the CIA. That is not, on the record. And of course, that's many more interventions. So only one time did a court, the International Court of Justice in 1983, or was it 86, came to the conclusion the United States had violated all kinds of international laws in mining harbors, killing civilians in that way, preventing food from coming in and out, and, in aiding the most corrupt, violent, brutal,
this was in Nicaragua.
They didn't even go to the court, and they didn't even recognize it. They didn't even have the decency to say, fuck you. I mean, they just said, fuck you without saying it. And they're not going to pay any compensation. But did anybody boycott them? I mean, did anybody? Not even the Soviet Union did. I mean, for Christ's sakes, the CIA, they can get away with anything.
Yeah.
Kill their own president, for Christ's sakes. So why not kill, a Russian president?
It really is a shocking, really profoundly disturbing reality check, wake up for people's, awareness of what kind of states we're living in, that the so-called leader of the free world, and Biden was addressing the United Nations General Assembly this week, kind of declaring how virtuous the United States was and demonizing the Russians. And yet we have this country and it's a year since they blew up the oil pipelines. And in your estimation, Ron, they are very capable of triggering a preemptive strike, a decapitation strike on Russia to take out the Russian president, with the absolute odious calculation that it will destabilize Russia as opposed to triggering a third world war. They think they could get away with it. It might sound absolutely fantastical, but from what you've said, from what we've discussed, it's entirely feasible or possible that this could happen.
Yeah. Well, even U.S. Americans are getting tired of it, because they would like to have some of their houses, fixed, and some of the schools. They got a school massacre once a week. They've got almost 2 times a day, mass murder. That's to say 4 people. So CIN, which is a very war for whore organization, did a poll last month. 45%, only 45% of U.S. Americans want to continue to finance this war. And the interesting thing is that 74%, I think it is, the Republicans don't want to do it. And yet 71% of Republicans don't want to continue it. And yet 74% of so-called liberal and progressive Democrats want to do it. And of course, Biden and this Bernie fucking Sanders and these, so-called women feminists, they want to continue. At the same time, in Denmark, only 15% of people polled last month don't want to continue. They want to send weapons and money constantly. 73% say it's great, and 12% don't give a damn. So, you kill a Russian president, I'm telling you, the atmosphere in much of Europe is like, great. Yeah. You remember what that whore for war said about 500,000 children being killed in Iraq?
Madeleine Albright.
Yeah. It was worth it. It was the money was well spent.
Yeah.
I mean,
we really are in lawless times where really anything goes. I mean, it's back to. It's back to the height of imperialism, in the 1930s, leading up to the Second World War. Ron Ridenour, thank you for joining me today and sharing your concerns, your insights, your passion for truth and fairness in this world. Really appreciate it, Ron. You've been working so hard for so many decades, and we really appreciate your great contribution to our stock of human knowledge and understanding of history. So thanks very much, Ron.
Well, you're